Okay, this is part 11, Hogwarts for Politicians. Kind of an interesting title, huh? I'm doing a few of these back to back. Thankfully, I have some time to do that. By the way, if you enjoy what I'm doing, please like and subscribe to the channel. And I'm always happy to see your comments, questions, ideas, anything you want to talk about, happy to discuss with you. In this section, part 11 is going to cover something very interesting and something that you can use yourself to become a much more powerful user of word magic. What we will talk about essentially is the same type of, or the same level of education that politicians, philosophers, lawyers, some of the greatest thinkers of human history have had access to a certain method of education that is very, very old, and it has evolved over many, many centuries and is in wide use today. So this is why I'm calling this section Hogwarts for Politicians. And as we go through this part of the presentation, you will see why. So Bill Clinton and Barack Obama are easily the two most recognizable rhetoricians in American politics, right? They're both very good speakers, excellent public speakers. Even though Bill Clinton, his very first speech given in the national arena was a huge flop. He even went on the night show. He went on the TV circuit and explained and kind of had fun and made fun of himself for his terrible performance. But he learned quite a lot from that failure, and since that time became quite a good rhetorician. Yeah, right. Politics aside, these two men are quite gifted speakers. So both of these men are trained in law and possess a talent for delivering the spoken word. They also have something in common that most people don't know, and it's that both of these men were educated in the tradition of the liberal arts. When most people think liberal arts, they think worthless college degree. There are real liberal arts colleges, and it used to mean something, and it still does if you find the right liberal arts college. A lot of colleges have used this term and have not really done it any justice. But I will explain what the liberal arts really are and what the power. There's some great power to be found in a true liberal arts education. You don't have to attend a brick and mortar school to obtain this very powerful method. You don't even have to sign up for any classes. This is something that through the magic of the internet, and as long as you're dedicated, right, you can learn this. I would say at minimum, dedicate a year to learning the liberal arts, at least the 3 parts. I'll break down all of it's traditionally known as the 7 liberal arts. I'll break it all down for you. And I think you're going to find this part quite powerful. Okay, so the liberal arts is a pedagogy used at elite schools, the real liberal arts. When I say liberal arts, I mean the real, honest, and true original liberal arts. It's used at elite schools in order to teach students how to think instead of being instructed on what to think, like most colleges do these days. This specialized training is an effective method of convincing large groups of people to think and act in a certain way. In some cases, the art of persuasion can be beneficial to a society. In other ways, of course, it can be harmful. I should mention that we all understand that there are certain colleges that have more prestige, that produce more people of influence. There are more graduates that will tend to have a greater influence in our society, right? Some of the Ivy League colleges, of course, or all of them. Harvard, of course, is a college it is at least 100 years older than the United States of America itself. Okay. So some of these colleges in North America have a tradition of the liberal arts that they teach their students how to think, not what to think. There's a huge difference here. Okay, and that's what makes the difference between like a Harvard and maybe some public university. Okay. However influential these two men are, politicians, of course, will shape their overall worldview to suit their agenda within their sphere of influence, right? So even though they have a liberal arts education, they know how to think, they're not going to share that with you, much less use their abilities to benefit everyone, right? Whereas philosophers can influence how people see their world for the entire lifespan of a civilization. It's a little bit different, for better or for worse, right? Philosophers are liberal arts educated in the sense of the classic sense of that term or that method. Okay. So what I'm getting at is a liberal arts education that teaches you how to think is where the influencers of our society come from. Whether they're politicians and they influence the course of a nation over many decades, whether it's a graduate of a university, of a liberal arts college who's a philosopher, who changes how people think, who influences the worldview over hundreds and thousands of years, such as Plato and Aristotle. There's varying degrees, of course, of the influence of a liberal arts education. It all comes down to intention, right? So in this part of the presentation, we will find out what makes a liberal arts education so special. You often hear liberal arts education just being like, you just went to college and you picked something and you just picked liberal arts just to get that bachelor's degree, right? But what most people don't know, what they don't realize is a true classical education is quite valuable indeed. And you're not going to find it in most colleges. Okay. So liberal arts education they have been used for a long time to train both powerful magi and sorcerers alike. In a very real sense, a classic liberal arts education can be like Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry for politicians, at least in the modern sense, right? If you're going to go into politics and you have a liberal arts, a true liberal arts education. It is like Hogwarts for politicians in that sense. So I'm going to introduce you to some terms you may not be aware of. These are some, or you may be aware of. And I'm going to give you I'm going to show you the method. It's actually quite simple. It's a systematic approach for learning and training your mind how to think. And it's just a step-by-step process, really. It's really not that difficult at all. It's quite simple. It's just repeating the steps, practicing the steps, and making them an integral part of your thought process. That's the important part here. Okay? So let's start with the history of the liberal arts. The trivium in Latin means 3 roads crossing. And these 3 roads, or these 3 educational methods, are known or consist of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. This method of education can be traced directly to Aristotle's Organon and the Ars Rhetorica, which are required reading for students of classical liberal arts colleges. Now, I know what you're thinking. Nobody wants to listen to some smarty pants telling them how to think. You've got to get past that. You've got to get past that if you want to be a very powerful word magician, and if you want to think, like truly think for yourself, right? You've got to get past that. I know there's a lot of there's a lot of associations made with high levels of education, classical education, and kind of this this highbrow, blue blood type of person who wears the sweater neatly folded over their shoulders, who owns a yacht, who summers in the Hamptons, things like that, who is sophisticated and refined and, but in an everyday practical sense, you want what's best for you and your loved ones in your life. And you like to think that you want to believe that you think for yourself, right? And it's really hard for me or for to hear myself or to hear anyone tell you that you're not really thinking for yourself, or that you never really learned how to think. That's painful and difficult to digest. Someone like me or anyone telling you that you don't know how to think. And I'm not here to tell you you don't know how to think, but that is going to be the message that's received for a lot of people. So I understand the pain. When I went, and so the path that I took, the way that I came into this information, it was presented to me in a way that at first I felt a little attacked. What do you mean I don't know how to think, right? Being a curious person myself, and of course my audience is very curious, all of you being curious, being seekers, right? We're all seekers. We're all looking to grow. There's always something we can learn, right? So I would look at it that way. I know that, especially in our society, to appear unintelligent is one of the greatest fears that we all have, to appear unintelligent, right? Unless, of course, it gives you some advantage and you're doing that for a very deliberate reason, right? So that people will underestimate you. But essentially, you don't want to feel unintelligent, and you don't want someone some of the worst interactions that you could find in our modern society or any society is that, people get in arguments and then they don't see eye to eye, and then one person invariably tells the other, you're not intelligent enough to understand what I'm saying, that kind of thing, right? You have to get past it in respect to this part of the presentation, because obviously I'm not here to tell you, I make so many mistakes every day. Obviously I'm not some highbrow person that's got everything figured out and I've got, but I learned this method at some point in my life. This was probably about 10 years ago or so. And this has served me so well in my life, and it's opened up so many doors, that it's something that I definitely want to share with my wonderful, high quality, amazing, curious, intelligent audience. And I think this is going to benefit you. So don't take this the wrong way as if this is me sitting here telling you, well, I'm going to tell you how to think and this is how to do it, blah, 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 blah. It's nothing like that. Okay? So just understand where I'm coming from here. So the term liberal arts comes from the Latin word libre, which means book, and it also means free. So after all, it was the educated of the Greco-Roman society whom were free, right? While the uneducated were considered slaves. The same is true today. Okay, the thing with the classical education is all of the questions that have been asked for thousands of years, all of the most foundational understandings of human behavior, human psychology, right, that were understood 2,000 years ago are true today, right? So in a very real sense, if you, and don't take this the wrong way, just because you have a certain perspective or a certain education doesn't mean you go around thinking less of people. That's not what this is about. This is about sharing. This is about expanding people's perspective and horizon. This also is not about you going around forcing this upon people, because that obviously isn't going to work, right? If you find this information helpful, you will invariably feel yourself enthusiastic about what you've learned. You will start to see results, and then you will want to share that with others. Be very careful about that, because when you share this with others, you will have a tendency to say, this is amazing. Do you know about this? And you might share it in the wrong way, that the receiver of your sharing, the receiver may, they may not receive it the way that you intended. Just be aware of that, and it's okay. If this resonates with you, then maybe share it with some people that you feel may be interested. But if this resonates with you, just leave it with you, essentially, and explore this for yourself. You can show people by example what I'm saying, right? You can spread this message by improving your life, showing through example. Okay. So this word Libra or liberal, right, means both book and free. So if you are educated, you are considered free, right? And it's the same type of idea today, right? If you think for yourself, you are free. You're not enslaved by the thoughts or the worldviews that are put upon you from others, right? You're free to think for yourself, like truly free to think for yourself, right? There's a lot of people that think, they believe anyway, they believe that they think for themselves, right? And there are some that have come into this realization on their own, or they have no formal classical education. They have no formal teaching in the 7 liberal arts. And yet they've come into a space where they genuinely think for themselves, which is amazing. That's what we want, right? But then there are a large group of people that believe that they think for themselves and they do not. Okay, don't take that as me just on my high horse telling everyone they're not, this or that, because that's not what that means at all. It's just reality. It's just reality. Okay, I'm not crapping on people that are not on the path, of course, we can't do that, right? Because we are, at some point, we ourselves were not on the path. You're not born coming into the path unless you're a very rare type of figure, right? Like a Christ figure, or the Prophet Muhammad, or some enlightened figure who's born into this. Some people are every so often, right? Okay, so the term classical education describes the liberal arts or the freeing of the mind. So when you hear the word liberal, okay, it really does mean freedom. Okay, don't think of it in the political sense, because that's not the sense we're discussing this here. So in this context, classic actually means of or belonging to the highest class. Again, don't get it twisted. Don't think that this is about being high class. In a sense, it is, in that it's the highest class of education, meaning if you can, if you're classically educated, it's the highest class of education because you are taught how to think. Therefore, you can go out into the world, and in any endeavor that you're interested in, you can learn that proficiently and excel at it because you can think for yourself. But also, a classical education is all about taking in information, analyzing critically, objectively, and subjectively, but analyze that information, throwing out what's irrelevant to you, what doesn't work, and taking the rest in and using it for yourself, right? Or using it for the betterment of others. That's really what a classical education is. It's not, you hear this term thrown out all the time. Critical thinking, but no one really goes, you don't really hear, how do you do it? How exactly do you think critically? Do you just compare things, and do you compare and contrast, and you look at contradictions, but what else is going on here, right? I'm going to go into that, and I'm going to give you some examples of some great, some of the greatest figures in human history that were classically educated, right? And this is something you can do for yourself. You can find these resources on the internet if you're interested. I'm going to break all this down for you, so don't worry. So to this very day, liberal arts or classical education is typically found at the oldest and most established schools, such as the ones attended by Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Many colleges which claim to be liberal arts schools may teach some classical topics, but they're not organized in quite the same way as these old established universities. So in brief, the trivium is comprised of 3 parts and is taught in a specific order. Okay, the order is very important. You know, in high school and college, for example, you have to learn, you want to learn general mathematics before you go to pre-algebra, and then you go to algebra. Then you might go to calculus, and you might go to trigonometry. You have a foundation and you build up. That's the same with everything, right? So this is essentially the same idea with the trivium, of course, right? Not a big shocker. These 3 parts or components will be summarized in order, and then I'll explain how they all fit together. The significance of the trivium method is that it gives the student a systematic approach or a reliable step-by-step framework on how to think about and approach any subject you want. It doesn't teach what to think about any given subject, okay? It only shows you a systematic approach for looking at and learning a subject, for understanding a subject. What subject you want to learn is up to you. How you want to think about that subject is up to you, right? So that is to say, this method, this trivium method, trains the student to learn any subject in a systematic manner. So you're learning each subject in a similar way. And when I say similar way, you start at point A, go to point B, go to point C, and every subject can be learned that way, and I'll show you how that's possible. And also I should mention that the trivia method allows the student to learn subjects much faster than having no systematic framework at all. Okay? They don't really give you a framework for learning. There's no systematic method for learning all subjects, right? You learn them a little differently. However, if you learn the trivium, then you can be a self-taught person and learn any subject you want. So the trivium method can be used for most any subject, which means mastery of the trivium method creates a powerful autodidact or a lifelong learner. Autodidact is just a fancy word of saying a self-taught person. One is able to enhance their life through learning using this method, having been afforded a classical perspective and a system on how to approach any new topic so that they are guaranteed to have a proficient level of understanding. So new topics are no longer scary to an autodidact or someone who has committed their understanding of the trivium method, who's internalized the trivium method, and they use that for all the subjects they learn, right? Every new subject is approached in the same way. So the trivium is quite a history and has been used by several old world religious orders, as well as esoteric seekers, and many of the greatest and most influential thinkers in the world and philosophers of Western civilization have used the trivium method. So let's use a bicycle to demonstrate how the trivium method works. So let's start with grammar. Grammar is the very first part of the trivium. If you look at it like a pyramid here on the left, grammar is the foundation of this trivium learning pyramid. You always start with grammar. Grammar doesn't mean how you put sentences and how you string words together. Okay? That's called special grammar. The grammar I'm talking about is general grammar. General grammar is how things are related, right? But the grammar of any subject is not how they're related. The grammar is the individual parts of whatever it is you're learning. In this case, we're learning how to build a bicycle, okay? So grammar, in the sense of the trivium, represents the fundamental facts of the bike. The fundamental facts being the individual parts of the bike. So first you learn all about the individual parts, which make up the specific type of bicycle you wish to build. And next, you must collect and inspect each part from every angle, right? And finally, you must learn the specific function of each part, right? So general grammar refers to the rules of bike parts and not the rules of specific grammar, like I said, such as any specific language. So you could convey this teaching of how to build a bicycle using the trivium method, and it would apply to any language, of course, right? Because there's a general understanding that transcends languages, and then there's a specific understanding just to that language. So we're not talking about the specific understanding or specific grammar to any one language. We're talking about the overall facts. In this case, it's the bicycle, right? The next step once you have all the parts and you know what each part is and what its individual function is in the bicycle, in the whole, once it's assembled, the next step is logic. Logic is in the middle. Okay, you could look at logic as the glue that kind of holds it all together. Once the parts have all been learned about and collected individually, the next step is learning about how each of these individual parts fit coherently together so that the bicycle is complete and operates correctly. Okay? An incorrectly assembled bicycle will not function properly, right? Which represents a contradiction of the facts, right? Facts in this case represent the individual bicycle parts. So if you have a contradiction of the facts, or the facts just don't add up, right? Then you've essentially you're missing some part of an understanding of the parts. So that either means that your logic has failed somehow, right? You're not understanding how the two parts fit together, or it probably means you don't understand the individual parts well enough to understand how they work together. Okay, so that's logic. The final piece is called rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is usually, with most people, it's a dirty word. It's like, oh, I don't want to hear any more of your rhetoric, right? Which is a shame, because rhetoric is very powerful. It's very important. And for most people, to have rhetoric to have a negative association with the word rhetoric means that they have a certain distaste for learning. And that only hurts the person who doesn't want to learn, or has this idea that learning is somehow associated with being, some sort of elitist or something, which is just preposterous. It's nonsense, right? So rhetoric, this stage represents the final product, right? You know about all the different individual parts from the grammar. You've now fit all the parts together. You have no logical contradictions, and you have a bicycle right before you. You've built the bicycle from all the parts. You understand all the parts. You know how they go together. Your logic is sound. Now it's time for the rhetorical phase of this operation. Okay? If this is the final product, the bicycle is the final test, as it were, this rhetoric demonstrates that you truly know what you are talking about. You're not just repeating what your teacher told you, right? That is to say, rhetoric is how one demonstrates their individual understanding of a certain subject inside and out. You're not just repeating this, but this is the tire, this bicycle, here's how you put it together. You're not just repeating step by step what your teacher told you, but you genuinely understand it because you completely applied grammar and logic, and you have sussed this out. You have gone through some trial and error, right? This isn't, by the way, the trivia method isn't just some smooth process, right? You may find in your bicycle building exercise, in your adventure in trying to build a bicycle, you may think you've got all the individual parts, and then you go to build it and you're like, shit, something's wrong here. You have to go back, take the bicycle apart, or at least partially, and look at the individual parts again, go back and do your grammar, learn more about the individual parts. Maybe you ordered the wrong style of bicycle parts and you got them mixed up with another type. You want to build one type of bike and you bought the wrong kind of part. right? So you have to know about all the parts, then how they fit together. Well, the rhetoric is the final test, right? How do you demonstrate your understanding of a subject inside and out? As in, you really know it. It's not just you're repeating it so that you can just get a grade for the class, you can pass the class and leave, but you really know it. And once you have it down solid like that, that's something that you have for your entire lifetime because you understand it, right? An entire class of students can memorize anything the teacher requires in order to pass a class. But how many students can turn around and actually teach, not just merely retell, but teach the subject to others, teach others how to build the bicycle? That's what it means to have a true understanding, to truly learn, right? So what rhetoric is doing is rhetoric is where you demonstrate your knowledge on something. And the rhetoric could very well include you building the bicycle with the class, right? Because that solidifies your understanding. Because if you to really know it, to really understand something, you have to do it over and over and over. And you have to encounter all the possible little gotchas and little hurdles and roadblocks along the way, right? And the only way to know that is by going through this scenario of building the bike a few times, right? By trial and error. But this rhetoric is your demonstration that I know how to do this, and I'm prepared for any questions from the class that may come out of left field along the way because I know this subject inside and out, right? And of course, bundled into this process of rhetoric, this demonstration, this talking about what you know, and you're demonstrating how you know it, inside, bundled into the rhetoric is grammar and logic. They're in there, right? And they serve as its foundation, right? So all three of these, the trivium, the three roads crossing, all work together in this method of learning. So it should logically follow that rhetoric essentially transcends and includes the former two elements of logic and grammar, right? Rhetoric is the final test that you know it, but it must include the two previous elements, okay?